This is Breaking Through the Shadows in Search of the Anima Mundi, World Soul, Part 2. Following the thread deeper into the dark. Michaela Villiers-Kendall. March 22, 2018, easy Zoom meetings, right? Okay, so this is, right, so this is like a recap from Part 1. The idea was to follow the thread, the astrological thread through the labyrinth in search of the shadow. So the first slide is the labyrinth, which is the Minotaur at the center, which represents the shadow. So Ariadne is following the thread through the labyrinth, the maze. In psychological terms, the labyrinth symbolizes the mind, the collective mind, and the individual mind. At the center dwells the Minotaur, half man, half beast, the symbol of the shadow. Next, or do I press N, you said, for the next slide? Oh, you got it, right. Okay, so this is the Minotaur. With his human hand, the beast is reasoning. He's drawing the nautilus, the ram's horn, and significator of the golden ratio. So he's part a beast, but he is part man, and he's trying to use his reasoning powers. So anyway, so done. Did that work? Enter. Oh, let's enter. Ah, got it. Okay, so this is the from the movie, and last time in Part 1, this is the Pale Man from Part 1 from the movie Pan's Labyrinth. The Pale Man is a Saturnian figure. He's there, he's in front of the furnace. So he's in the center of the labyrinth. He, similarly to the Minotaur, he represents the shadow, which is represented by Saturn, Pluto. So Saturn, Kronos, he represents who eats, in mythology, he ate his own children so they would not grow more powerful and overthrow him. So, pleasant character. Anyway, okay, next. Great. So here he is in the Goya painting of Saturn, Kronos eating his children. There's actually a song by Tool, the heavy metal band, quite old now, but called The Grudge. And that it actually speaks about Saturn eating his children. It says about the 9, the 10, and about let go of the grudge, which the shadows is about the grudge, really. Anyway, so next. Okay, so this is Rhea, Saturn's wife in mythology, and she's presenting a stone. She's had to trick Saturn because he keeps eating their children. So she's wrapped a stone in linens and she's presenting it to Saturn, which he swallows. So that's the only way she can stop him eating them all. And actually then the baby that survives, she hides the baby and it grows up to become Zeus, Jupiter, and actually does overthrow Saturn. So he was right about that, but he missed the last one. So that's next one, I guess. So this is the faun in the movie in Pan's Labyrinth, speaking to Ophelia. And he is a Saturnian character too. In fact, in the movie, he was played by the same actor that played the Pale Man. And that was not coincidental because he is meant to represent the two sides of Saturn. One is the paternal protector, the authority figure, Capricorn, and the other is the Satan, the shadow, the negative side. the grudge. So he says to her, "You're not born of man, it was the moon that bore you." And he's speaking of Hecate, the dark goddess of the moon. So next. The next slide, yeah. So this is Hecate, the moon goddess. And she is seen with, she has the ability to go down to hell with her hellhounds to guard her and her torches to light the way. It was she who helped Demeter search for Persephone when she was abducted down to hell. They searched through the world, but then they had to descend finally to hell to retrieve her. So she's a dark scorpionic character, but also positive. She's a positive, feminine, plutonic goddess, often depicted with an owl under the moon. You see the snakes, they're scorpionic too. Next. Next, yeah. So that's Ophelia, the heroine of Pan's Labyrinth. She's at the feast down in the center of the labyrinth, and there's a feast which has wonderful fruit on it and all this food, and it's tempting. So this is, yeah, that's another image of the forbidden fruit, which is the pomegranate, and that's Persephone in the romantic painting. So the forbidden fruit is a symbol of it's similar to the Garden of Eden, where Eve eats the forbidden fruit. And it's a symbol of her losing her innocence or naivety. But in the shot of Ophelia, there's the furnace in the background. So danger accompanies the loss of innocence. And at that point, I want to draw attention to Del Toro's deliberate comparison with, in looks and everything actually, with Anne Frank, who was the, most people know, but history isn't very good these days in schools, but most people know Anne Frank was the German schoolgirl who had to hide out in Amsterdam during the war, World War II, with her family and another family, because the Nazis had occupied Amsterdam, and they hid for 2 years. And so that was in 1944 that they came out, and they were arrested eventually. So he set the movie deliberately in 1944 to draw attention, the furnace in the background, the pile of shoes, which will go on to, I think that's next, is that the next, after the pomegranate? Yeah. Well, no, it's somewhere there, but anyway, there's a pile of shoes. It's okay, that's fine. And that represents the Holocaust. So he's drawing an obvious analogy to Anne Frank. So that's the thread I thought maybe to follow next, because this whole theme obviously is about the shadow and about war. And the worst war that's ever been is, up to now, is, let's hope, is World War II. It was a terrible inferno of a war. Anyway, so next, yeah, go on to war. It's a theme. Next. Right. So a fine line separates a fighter from a warrior. One is motivated by reason, the other by purpose. One fights to live, the other lives to fight. So it's really speaking about the difference between the two war gods, between Aries and Libra, between Mars and Venus. Aries, the god of war, and he lives to fight, and he loves war. And Athene, the goddess of war, the Libran goddess of war, opposite in the zodiac, who leads in war when necessary. She's the great strategist. And we could go to the next one, showing her. Next. Well, that's him, that's Mars. But yeah, that's Mars with the horn, and then that's, yeah, that's Athena. So she's the strategist, she's the necessary goddess of war who fights for justice when war must be fought. So I think next is the pile of shoes, I think. Yeah, that's the Holocaust. So the necessary to fight, for instance, when, and obviously World War II, it was the worst genocide in human history. There've been many genocides down the years, but this was the worst. 6 million people were murdered. So sometimes war has to be fought, as in World War II. Otherwise, genocides would be carried out, and you can't be innocent. That's another thing about the pomegranate and going down to hell and Persephone. Innocence is all very well and love is wonderful, but it doesn't fight the necessary war. While mankind is still possessed by the shadow, there will always be wars. In fact, this is a really good book. I just want to show up here, Terrible Love of War. I don't know if you can see it, by James Hillman. And it discusses, he's the great psychological philosopher. He's very much into astrology too. So it's a very good exploration of why mankind is so drawn to war. And actually, I just wanted to read from his other book, which is The Soul's Code, which is another very famous book. And I've had that for 20 years. It's very beaten up, but that is a wonderful thing for any astrologer to read if you haven't already, because it talks about the acorn and the oak and about choosing your parents. In fact, there's a little bit I would just want to read from it. I will read, I think, at the next slide, but I'll read in a second about the shadow. So the next slide. Okay, so the door is locked. Yeah, we'll go on to her chart and then I'll read about this. So the faun, Saturn, Capricorn, he talks to Ophelia about the door to the labyrinth. The door is locked, and also she can't get back in, she can't get out again. So she says to him, it's locked. And he says, in that case, create your own door. In other words, your imagination, your intuition. And actually it's, Mark Jones has a very good quote about creativity in his book, Healing the Soul, which is an evolutionary astrology book. And he says, in following our creative spark path, without putting security on external dependencies, staying true to it, we transcend the losses of the external world. Creativity is the torch of Hecate that we carry as we descend, as we must if we are to confront the shadow and expose it to the light of consciousness. Right, so the next, right, so this is Anne Frank's natal chart. And, right. So a quote Carl Jung said about the door, small and hidden is the door that leads inward. So it's not easy to find, it's not even easy to find the door to consciousness, but it needs to be searched for. So I'll just speak about Anne Frank first, and then I'll read a little bit of that. So Anne Frank, so she couldn't open the door of their house and escape out into the world, as that world had become a dark and dangerous place, a place where the grudge raged, where it was busy consuming its children. That door was barred and would only open when she and her fellow inmates were taken to their deaths in the concentration camps. But she had some time before that happened, a 2-year period between July 6, 1942, and the end of which was marked by a lunar eclipse at 14 degrees Capricorn, which I'll show later, which took place in her 12th house on the 6th of July 1944, which was the end of the period. A month after that, the arrest would come on the 4th of August 1944, and that was a lunar eclipse, actually on the day as well, at 12 degrees Aquarius. So you'll be able to see, as I put the charts up, how the dates and the events link to her charts, and yeah, but particularly lunations. So that eclipse took place in her 8th house, as you can see, is Aquarius, and square to her Chiron at 12 degrees Taurus, which is up there in the 11th. And God, they haven't put Chiron, but never mind. It's at 12 degrees Taurus. Right, so yeah, okay. So it's important to consider when Anne was born and where, as it is with all of us. When you do a birth chart, you have to consider, obviously, the time and the place, and the time in history is relevant as well. The whole history of where you were born as well as when you were born. So Anne was born in 1929. They haven't put the date up there, but it was the 12th of June, 1929. You can easily find it on the data sites, obviously. So she was born in 1929, and that was 10 years after the end of World War I, and the Versailles Treaty was signed, 1919. And 10 years before the beginning of World War II, 1939, so it was right in the middle. And 1929 was relevant because it was the year of the great stock market. I've got a drink, sorry. I'll go to the side. Should have brought a glass. But anyway, so it was the year of the great stock market crash, the Great Depression, that hit America, but it hit worldwide, and it destroyed lives. It was a very Great Depression. So the thing was that in the Versailles Treaty, when that was signed, it was an agreement between the victors of World War I, that reparations should be made by the losers, Germany, and its allies, to pay for the damage done during World War I. America loaned Germany the money with which to pay the debt. America did quite well as the moneylender, as it did during World War II. But when the Great Depression struck 6 months after Anne's birth, it began a downturn that would lead all the way to World War II 10 years later. It was very good for Hitler's career because he was able to exploit the grudge that was building in the German people. And obviously inflation was horrendous. It was everywhere, but in Germany they had to have suitcases of money to buy a loaf of bread. It was worse than ever because of the debt they were in. So he did exploit that. So anyway, that's her chart. That's when she was born. Pluto in Cancer in the 12th house. Pluto went into Cancer at the start of World War I, 0 degrees Cancer, and it's conjuncted Saturn in the start of Cancer as well, at the beginning. So she was born into this aftermath of war, and then she was born into this great financial loss, and then that left this huge wound, Chiron, and which actually then grew and grew until, and the 1930s, of course, the year after is when Pluto was discovered. So it encapsulates that period and shows that building. Anyway, so as I say, it did Adolf Hitler's career no end of good. He had built up a following. He'd started the Nazi Party in the 1920s, and in fact, there's a few notes about him here because it's quite, yeah, it's quite interesting. He had fought in World War One. If people don't know, he'd been at Ypres, he'd been at Arras, he'd been at Passchendaele. He was only a corporal, but something I didn't know, he was actually awarded the Iron Cross, first class, at the end of near the end of the war in 1918. It was actually on the 4th of August, which is that relevant date again, which actually, as you'll see on his chart, we'll put up after. Actually, I think we could put his chart next. Next, I think it's next. Not sure. No, okay, well, it's after that. But this is when she was, this is towards the end of the period where they were in the house. This was 3 months before the arrest, which was the 4th of August. Another lunar eclipse, 12 degrees Aquarius, squaring that Chiron, which was in 1929, which was squaring also Hitler's Saturn at 13 degrees Leo. So, so that Chiron was right in the middle of the T-square of these eclipses and his Saturn. So anyway, so she made an entry then in her diary, and she said how there is a destructive urge in people, the urge to rage, murder, and kill. At that point, the sun was conjunct her natal Chiron, which we just talked about in Taurus. Mars was conjunct her natal Pluto in the 12th, sextile to her north node in Taurus, and trine to her south node in Scorpio, and square natal Uranus. So it was building to an end, and she obviously felt something at that point. Yeah. So anyway, so the next chart. I think that's Hitler's noon chart. I put his noon chart up, and I'll put his natal chart up a bit later, to show that if you put his sun on the midheaven, you get Saturn right on the descendant, which is really interesting. And interestingly, and I'll show it next, but I want to just say something about him first. Winston Churchill, also, if you put his sun at noon on the midheaven, then you also get Saturn, which was his Saturn in Aquarius, 9 degrees Aquarius, which is a very important degree as well in all of this, directly opposite Hitler's Saturn. So that's quite remarkable. And they were both great orchestrators of the whole thing. In fact, even when others joined, Stalin joined in the war, and obviously Roosevelt and then Truman. He was Winston Churchill on the part of the Allies was the main orchestrator, although Stalin was slightly apart. Anyway, so yeah, so I just wanted to say something about Hitler here too. And yeah, so I want to say it in this book, actually, because this is the Soul's Code, where James Hillman is talking about the shadow. And he says about the shadow, he says, about karma and zeitgeist. And he says, there is a metaphysical mystery at work which the limits of human reason cannot grasp. Even the worst of the bad seeds takes part in a cosmic pattern of the zeitgeist. Hitler's personal karma belongs to a world plan. He says about the shadow, he says quite a lot, I won't say it all, but he says the natural born killer is all too human. Since humans have shadows whose depths reach to the collective level of murder, human behavior is prompted by this archetypal force. Hitler knew the shadow all too well, indulged it, was obsessed by it, and strove to purge it, but he could not admit it in himself, seeing only its projected form as Jew, Slav, intellectual, foreign, weak, and sick. The grudge was nurtured in Hitler, obviously during the First World War, but then afterwards his hatred of the Jewish people began when he was a child, but then obviously it increased. It increased when, in the Depression, the Jewish people, they were often bankers and they were money lenders. And so there become being a grudge with the population that they were the money lenders and people couldn't get any money. So there was, as I said, he exploited that. He also hated the Russian people. So the Slavs, the Bolsheviks during the First World War. So he had these grudges that he couldn't really wait to let go. And it was as though he plotted that he couldn't wait to unleash on the Jewish people and on the Russians. And actually that was his undoing. Yeah, there's his noon chart again. That was his undoing in the end, because it was those two things that really undid him. If he'd stuck by helping, rebuilding Germany and helping them to get financially sound again, which he did remarkably, then he would have been a great leader and he would have led Germany on to great glory and maybe had a Third Reich that went on for 1,000 years. But the grudges took him down, because it was Russia really that England held sway at the start of the war and sort of held it, put the brakes on, but they wouldn't have defeated him by any means. And even America stepped in later, but it was attacking Russia when he did in 1941, and I'll go on to that, that brought him down. And actually so did the Jewish people in science, because most of the scientists that developed the nuclear bomb had to leave. Einstein had to leave in 1926 or 19, no, he left in 1930, the start of the 1930s. But and did a lot of other Jewish scientists because of the persecution, and they were his greatest minds. And if he'd had them, then he'd have probably got the atom bomb first. So the grudge worked two ways in this. Unfortunately, it cost all those lives dreadfully. Anyway, so next, I think we've done, I'll just say about Winston Churchill, something interesting there. Winston Churchill, his Pluto, which is hard to see on there. Yeah, there it is in Leo. Sorry, no, that's Aries, that's Uranus. Pluto in, that's down there in Taurus, 21 Taurus, was actually conjunct, let's see, no, it was square, and I'll go on to that next actually. When Hitler, I think it's when Hitler became Chancellor, I think that's next, or is it, okay. That's The Darkest Hour, that's the movie that was released this year. And as I said before, in part one, movies seem to come out at, they pick up the timing of things, they pick up things in the air. And just like we're having this growing problem with between Russia and Britain right now, seems to be escalating. It came out just then. So Churchill doing his famous victory sign. But anyway, Churchill was, having his Saturn opposing, and his Saturn actually was conjunct, as we'll see in the next slide. It was conjunct the Third Reich's sun. Yeah, that's it. So the Third Reich was formed on the 30th of January, 1933. That's the noon chart. And Saturn was conjunct the sun. the sun was at 9 degrees Aquarius. And as I just said, Churchill's Saturn was conjunct. So obviously anyone who watches this have time to go over all this before, because it's fascinating how when you follow the threads of it and how the collective events match with the personal ones. And it's all one great picture. It's quite remarkable. And there's only time to show a small part of it here. But you can see how the thread goes along. So also the interesting thing about that was that at, hold on, the start of World War I, Uranus was actually at 9 degrees Aquarius. So, the Third Reich is conjunct the Uranus of the start of the chart of World War I on 3rd of August 1914. So it is directly that Uranian energy, that Aquarian energy, is coming straight out of World War I, and that Hitler was so fixated on. Even the insignia of the SS, the Third Reich, the badge they wore, is the lightning bolt. So it's literal, as it so often is in astrology, isn't it? At the end of World War I, Neptune was at 9 degrees Leo, so directly opposite the starting point of it transited in an opposition the Uranus of the start of World War I. So Neptune was there at 9 degrees Leo, and as you'll see, Pluto went into Leo at the start of World War II, and then traveled through until it got to that point at 9 degrees Leo, and at that point it was ended. So it was as though it traveled through Leo and got to the point of opposition with Uranus at the start of World War I, and then stopped. So, and all of this is heavily contacting Hitler's chart, obviously. So the next one is next slide, is that's Hitler. Hitler actually decided to be made, because it was actually Hindenburg was still in power then as president of Germany. He persuaded him to make him Chancellor of Germany. And how could he say no after he'd saved Germany from financial ruin? Because Hitler was simply refusing to pay back any more loans. He just started tearing up all the treaties. But anyway, that's one way. People should have seen there was going to be a problem there. But and then, of course, he started reclaiming lands, like the Rhineland was taken at the Treaty of Versailles. And so that was every bit of his plan was to take everything back, was to get the grudge satisfied, was to get payback, was to reclaim the lands taken, was to get everything back from World War I. So he decided to be made Chancellor on the 10th of February, that is, 1933, which is just a fortnight after the Third Reich was formed, and on a lunar eclipse, which is pretty silly if you'd known astrology to make yourself a leader on a lunar eclipse. It's not the greatest idea, but there you go. There are always other forces at work, aren't there, that probably weren't on his side, but certainly seems so anyway. So that was at 21 degrees Leo, and of course Churchill's Pluto, apart from other things, that degree goes through as well, through the whole war. And Churchill's Pluto was at 21 degrees Taurus, squaring Hitler as Chancellor. So anyway, so next slide. okay, yeah, so he couldn't wait to get everything really in operation. He was very impatient, and it says something in the book about that, about impatience, and I'll just read that too before I say what that is. James Hillman talks about shadow having impatience when it's the bad seed, because he talks about Hitler. He does a whole chapter on Hitler, in fact, and he talks about the demonic. In this book, he talks about the acorn being the daemon. So, and then when it's the bad seed, which is the guide, which is a soul guide, which is our guide, it's like our higher self. It knows why we've chosen the time, the place, the parents, as astrology says. Certainly, evolutionary astrology says that we've chosen our soul path and our parents and our whole background to be born into. And it's our daemon, our higher self, that knows and guides us. And that explains why we act and why we take interest in the things we do, because it's part of our path. But there is the bad seed also, the demon that some people carry, that, and certainly Hitler did, that is more the demonic than the daemon. And he says to reflect upon Hitler is to do more than present a case study in psychopathy or political tyranny. It is a ritual act of psychological discovery, and an act as necessary to the claim of being a conscious human as remembering the Holocaust and reviewing the Second World War. So to explore, the psychological trait that goes with an iced heart, he said, is rigidity and incapacity to yield, to flow, to let go. Like letting go, as that song said about the grudge. He was obstinately rigid, inflexible, immovable. He could simply not change his mind or nature. At the very end, in Berlin, 1945, when an aide suggested that possibly some things might have been done differently, Adolf Hitler cried out in baffled anguish, "But don't you see, I cannot change." So, at his cost, but unfortunately it cost at millions cost as well. So also he was impatient, and that's another thing that's really interesting, because if you look at the Sabian symbol to his Saturn, it's an old captain in a rocking chair. It's a symbol, if I got it, it's 13 Leo. Okay, a restless contemplation, an impatience, jumping the gun, trapped in the past, an eagerness for new battles. That's 13 degrees Leo, that's his Saturn. And that's exactly how he was. So he couldn't wait to put everything, get power and put everything into action. And what he did on August the 5th was another eclipse, right on that 13-degree Aquarius, which was right across that Saturn at 13 degrees Leo of his. He created the Office of Jewish Immigration, which was the first step into the persecution of the Jews. And that's what he did right on that eclipse. It's quite amazing. But anyway, so next slide. So this is May 10th, 1940, noon chart, Amsterdam. That's another thing he created, the Blitzkrieg, which is the lightning war, very Uranian. And as it says on there, Hitler's North Node, the transiting North Node was conjunct Hitler's Uranus in the 12th house. And the Blitzkrieg was a lightning war that he had invaded Belgium and Holland. And it's terrible what they did. It was hellfire. And he called it the lightning war. On that very day, though, May 10th, that he did that. And you can see the sun again. I think the sun was conjunct, hold on. it's conjunct Churchill's chart, something in Churchill's chart on May 10th. But anyway, in fact, that sun that's conjunct his Pluto, and Churchill was asked to be premier on that day because everyone saw that it was no good having Chamberlain anymore. They needed someone who could handle war, and Churchill had a fine pedigree in that, although he'd made a terrible mistake. Gallipoli in the First World War. He was Lord of the Admiralty, and a lot of people know about Gallipoli. It is mentioned in the film The Darkest Hour, when thousands and thousands, it was a bloodbath, and because of the mistakes made by the Admiralty and others, not just him, other politicians, thousands and thousands die. A lot of Australians, a lot of the Commonwealth soldiers in Turkey, in Gallipoli. That was in 1915, and actually, I think there was an aspect to his chart then, and I think it was an aspect to his Saturn. Something was in. I think it was Uranus was conjunct his Saturn in Aquarius at 9 degrees Aquarius, and so it's as if he is being offered not just to use that terrible experience of and obviously that he held that was part of his depression, his black dog, that his conscience about that mistake and not to make it. You can imagine how he must have felt being offered the premiership, although he felt it was his destiny. Also a huge responsibility. And you can see that in the chart, because he wouldn't want to make the same mistakes again. But anyway, he was courageous and he felt it was his destiny and he took it on. So anyway, so the next chart. And of course, that was Holland, Amsterdam, the Blitzkrieg, where Anne was, back to Anne. And you can see also, if you look at her chart, how that affected her. This was really the beginning of them going into hiding. By 1942, it was untenable. The Nazis had occupied since 1940. So anyway, so May 10th, the year after 1941, was the London Blitz. And again, it all aspect is Hitler's chart and Churchill's chart. The full moon was at 20 degrees Scorpio the next day. So all of that it was all hitting the same contact points. But the thing about that was that Hitler remarked to his generals that it was actually the London Blitz, the bombing of London, was just a camouflage for the invasion of Russia that Hitler was planning. So the grudge, again, really he didn't see England as a threat, Britain as a threat. And really it was just a matter of, it's like swatting away a fly. And he was going to give it up after that. I think that the Battle of Britain was the last thing he just, that was fought, and then he decided to give it away, the planned invasion of England, after he lost the Battle of Britain, because he thought he'll come back to that later, because he really wanted to get onto Russia. That was what he really, really wanted to do, eliminate all the Jewish people and take over Russia completely and get back at them for the First World War. So that was another big mistake he made, obviously, because taking on Russia was madness, and he was then on two fronts. But that's what he did, and then so that year, really, that 1941 was a turning point year. So the next one. Next slide. I have to have a drink and then coffee. So, so this is Stalingrad, the battle. Again, there was a solar eclipse, 15 degrees Aquarius. It keeps going between Aquarius and Leo and Taurus. It's the same fixed grand cross that keeps happening, but mostly with Leo and Aquarius through most of these big battles. Certainly these Russian ones. Stalingrad went on for months and months, but finally there was victory on the 2nd of February. The sun was at 13 degrees Aquarius. And the eclipse actually took place on the solar eclipse on the 5th of February. So, and actually that Saturn in Gemini was conjunct Hitler's Pluto. So he was, I mean, he'd really lost it at that point because there was no way he could conquer Russia. And his generals knew it too, and they were being sent to their death by the thousands and thousands. Stalingrad was the bloodiest battle in world history. Yeah, just enormous. But of course, Russia won in the end. And the Germans had depended on their machines too, their tanks. Well, they all froze up by the time the winter came. They were done. Very stupid, but you know, his being a corporal came back on him in the end because you know he really had he was no Athena, he was no strategist, and his grudge ruled him. So anyway, next one. Let's see, the next. And if you look at Anne's chart, all of these degrees are being hit too in her chart. I'll get back to hers. So then the battle at Kursk in Russia. This was by this time Pluto was 8 degrees Leo. It's creeping up to that 9-degree point, but it didn't get there. It kept on going back. And obviously this, you know, it's squaring Hitler's sun at 0 degrees Taurus, as it had done from the very start when it got to 0 degrees Leo. And it's just getting worse and worse. It's going towards his Saturn. I mean, he really, he really didn't stand a chance. So pity he didn't, he would never have believed that. But anyway, so yeah, so this battle, Kursk, was the biggest tank battle in history, and it was won by Russia. Jupiter-Pluto was exactly conjunct at 7 degrees Leo, conjunct the solar eclipse at 8 degrees Leo on the August 1st, which was the day it was won, which is remarkable. And his generals, I mean, they knew the game was up by then, but they couldn't do anything about it. You know, they maybe should have put their foot down sooner, but they too late. I'm sure a lot of them were thinking about, as they did the year after, they tried to assassinate him, but, you know, way too late. Anyway, next clip, next slide. Next slide. Ah, yeah. Okay, so the 11th anniversary of Hitler becoming Chancellor, I mean, it was over by then. It was 1944, but obviously, you know, he wouldn't believe it was over. Go on and on and on, more and more deaths. The camps were still raging. And 19 degrees Leo was the lunar eclipse. And it, the sun is Aquarius, opposite. It's on the chart. The victory is with the Jupiter and Moon, conjunct the Moon, is with the Allies. The main thing always to watch is the Pluto, though. It's conjunct the North Node there, you know. So anyway, and Mars and Uranus is now conjunct Hitler's Pluto in Gemini. Anyway, so next. Motoring on. It's a whole world war to get through. It was a bit ambitious. But anyway, it's trying to show the thread. So the full moon, 16 degrees, this is D-Day, and things are this definitely turned the tide. I mean, you know, once America came in Pearl Harbor, December 1941, I mean, that was after Russia, that was the next blow. I mean, it was all, you know, really over, but he just wouldn't lie down. So D-Day, so then again, you can see the Mars is conjunct the Pluto, which is now at 7, 8 degrees Leo. And Jupiter was right at that 21 degrees Leo. Yeah, so D-Day, and I don't know if I put my father's chart up next, but he actually fought on D-Day. He was in the number 4 commando. No, it's not next, but it will be a bit further. Okay, so all this time, Anne Frank has been in the house since 1942. This is her last solar return. And it shows that Pluto all the time was squaring her Venus, which Venus is the ruler of her North Node in Taurus. And so Pluto squared her Venus the entire time. And it's up there in the 10th house. You know, she's got the writer that she was a writer. She wanted to be a journalist. She was only 15, but you know, and 13 when she went into the house. But she kept the diary because she wanted to keep a record of what was happening. It wasn't just as a little girl's diary. It was because she wanted to have it published at some stage. So she kept it with a mind to that, and actually wrote in her diary that there was a contest in March 1944. And of course, she hoped that she'd be able to enter it. And she then edited her diary, suitably changed the names and things because she did want to protect her family. And later, when her father, who was the only survivor of the camps, came out and was given the diary, then he kept her wishes and to have it published. And obviously, he saw the good father, her, you know, her Capricorn. Pluto is the polarity point to her Cancer Capricorn. Cancer Pluto, the polarity point being in Capricorn in the 6th house, the house of service, and the good father. And it was her father that kept her name alive and actually published. And yeah, couldn't believe it when he was handed the diary. Anyway, so that's where she was at that point. That's her and it shows very much her last solar return. Saturn is about. She's having a Saturn opposition, and Saturn is about to go into Cancer, which is her 12th house. And shortly after that, in August, she was arrested. They were arrested and sent to the camps. That Saturn is entering her 12th house, squaring her natal 4th house in Libra, where Neptune has also entered. So they're squaring each other at that point. So anyway, so the next, So this is the lunar eclipse in 1944, July 6, exactly a year since they entered the house on July 6, 1940, sorry, 2 years since they entered the house in 1942. And this is the eclipse that happens right across her 12th house, 6th house, that signals that it's over. I think her Mars is being aspected there. No, in that one it isn't, is it? Could be. At some point her Mars is aspected. Her Mars is actually the skip step in her, you know, in EA astrology. It's directly in between her nodal axis at 17 degrees Leo, and it squares her nodes at 19 degrees Taurus, North Node, 90 degrees Scorpio, South Node. And her Mars rules her midheaven, Aries, war. And obviously, Pluto is this whole time trined her midheaven. So war is what she's been born into. But weirdly enough, it is actually what makes her famous, what actually does give her, as she says in her diary, she wishes that she would be remembered forever after her death. And she does get her wish on that. Anyway, so the next one. The next slide is, okay, so this is before that last one when they're in the house that signals the arrest. This is the eclipse, solar eclipse, 27 degree Cancer, which actually squares Hitler's ascendant at 26 Libra. And he thought he'd got away with that. There was an assassination attempt and it failed. And he thought that meant that he was invincible, even though the war was obviously going very, very badly by then. They were on their last legs. And the generals desperately, there was a very famous Valkyrie film describing the assassination attempt, but too late. Actually, the Allies wouldn't have wanted him to be killed, strangely enough, because they had plans they had to put into place at that point. I think it was to do with the USA invading France, and which was planned. And so it wouldn't have been the best thing for him to have been assassinated at that point. They needed him to go on a little longer, and he actually wasn't. And he's, Jupiter trined his sun. Jupiter was at nearly at the start of Virgo, so it trined his Taurus sun in 0 degrees Taurus. And so it was like a protection, but it really wasn't a protection, because Saturn is I think it's squared something else. Anyway, let's go on. Yeah, Saturn squared something in his chart too. I can't look what that is, but you can find out. Which showed is over, basically. Anyway, so that's his chart, so you can see what it probably was there. Yeah, but I won't dwell on it. I'll push on. But it was over for him. That eclipse showed it was over, and actually it was one of his prenatal lunar eclipses too that picked that up. Lunar eclipse, this was the one on August the 4th, 1944 following, and this was at 12 degrees Aquarius, again, squaring Anne's Chiron, 12 degrees Taurus, and they were arrested actually on August 4th, 1944. Someone betrayed them. They had friends that would have been loyal the whole time, like Meep, who brought them food, and but there was someone who had betrayed them. So they were arrested and taken to a camp for a month, and then they were transported to Auschwitz. Okay, so the next one. Next slide. Okay, this is the full moon at 8 degrees Taurus, October 31st, the girls were transported to Bergen-Belsen. Their mother was left in Auschwitz. She was too sick. She was dying. She was dying of starvation. She had a rocky relationship with Anne, and Anne says in her diary, she says she's a bit hard on her mother. She's a bit sarcastic, but they had a friction between them. But her, if you look in her chart, her moon Neptune conjunction is at the end of Leo, and that was being aspected at that time, when just before they left, their mother got taken into the hospital because she was starving. She was giving them their food, her bread, what little bread they had, and she actually starved to death after they left. They transported 70,000 from different camps, Auschwitz, a lot of from Auschwitz and other camps, to Bergen-Belsen. Bergen-Belsen was in Germany. That's because they were drawing in. The Russians were on the way by that time. They were the first to liberate the camps. And they were heading towards Auschwitz first. And so rather than give up then, you'd have thought they'd just give up the ghost and leave. They kept, the Nazis kept on keeping the camps going, trying to kill as many as possible before the Russians came. Mad. And they transported 70,000 into Bergen-Belsen, which was only built for 10,000. So that was when they transported. And as you can see, that degree of Taurus, that full moon was right, and it was squaring the Pluto, right on Anne's Venus, natal Venus. So anyway, so the next slide. So then 3 months after that, January 28th, the full moon then is conjunct Pluto. That was when Anne actually, because there were witnesses from their school days that were in Bergen-Belsen as well, and the two girls were there, the two sisters, and Anne actually said to one of them at that point that she didn't want to live anymore because she was sure her parents were both dead. She couldn't think that her father had survived. in Auschwitz, and so she didn't want to live, and she proclaimed that at that point. And then shortly afterwards, it's thought there was typhus, because there was starvation, there was typhus. There was no gas chamber at Bergen-Belsen, but people just died of starvation and typhus. So shortly after that, they think that she contracted typhus the start of February, and then possibly died toward mid-February towards the end. And there are transits for that, but we don't really have time. We'll push on, but you can see the chart there. It's very harrowing. Okay, this is my father's chart, Gordon Kendall, because as I said, he fought on D-Day. He was with number 4 Commando. He was actually born on August the 4th, 1915. If you go back to World War I, a lot of these dates, again, a lot of these points, these natal chart, these chart points are in line with battles that took place in World War I. And he was born during the Battle of, which one? I think it was Ypres, the one that Hitler was in. And also that was when Gallipoli took place as well, around that time. So Hitler's chart, Churchill's chart. My father was born like a lot of others, born in 1915 during World War I to fight in World War II. So anyway, that was his finest hour. With D-Day, he fought at D-Day, landed on Sword Beach with Lord Lovett, and Pluto was conjunct his sun up there at a noon chart. And yeah, it was his finest hour. That was obviously, it was harrowing, but what was his worst hour though was when he actually was among the British soldiers who liberated Belsen. And that's, I think, going on to the next chart. Or, yeah. No, that's not, that's Hitler's. But where that's connected was the British liberated Belsen on April the 15th. And Hitler's last solar return was on April the 20th. Pluto actually went direct. Oh, and I wanted to say to you about January 28th, that chart, that full moon, just when Anne was saying that her parents were probably dead, that's when the Russians arrived in Auschwitz and liberated it, and liberated her father on that full moon, conjunct Pluto. Anyway, so then the British get to Belsen, she's already died. Just back to the Hitler's solar return chart there. So Pluto goes direct on his, actually on his solar return, Pluto goes direct, and that's it. I mean, Pluto will not go back to those degrees again. It's going on now to 9 degrees, it's finished, and he's finished. Yeah, so amazing. And obviously, if you look at those transits to his chart, it's quite amazing that, you know, the moon conjunct Pluto, etc. So just go on, just next. So that was, yeah, I'll just finish about my father then, because that's interesting in Belsen. They got to Belsen, and they didn't know what to expect. The stench, they smelt the stench. It was his worst. As I say, the war was pretty good for my father, although obviously some of the battles were terrible and he lost friends, and it was horrendous in many ways, but it was also glorious in many ways too. The worst thing he said was when he was to bayonet a German soldier, when he was a lookout, and he had to bayonet him because he was a lookout. He was another lookout on the German side, and he had to be silent about it. But that was a one-to-one, and my father was a very gentle man, although he was a commando. Anyway, so, and that 13 degrees Leo, 13 degrees Aquarius, right on his sun. Uranus, when he was born, Uranus was at 13 degrees. During that battle of Ypres, was 13 degrees Aquarius. So his sun was opposite that 13 degrees Aquarius. Amazing. So the shock for him came when they went to the concentration camp to Bergen-Belsen, and they smelt it long before they got there. When they got there, it was horrendous. Skeletons, they couldn't tell what half the people, what even sex they were, how old they were. He described how there was a person who was skeletal who looked up at him and smiled, and obviously recognizing that they'd been liberated, and then died. And unimaginable. I mean, they had to burn the huts because of typhus, and they had to bury the bodies, piles of bodies, with diggers in mass graves. And my father never really, that was what he really didn't recover from. He sort of had a sadness to him, knowing that humanity could do that, the shadows, not knowing the depth of it. Yes, he knew about the war and fighting and everything else, but he didn't know about that. And when people found out about that and saw it firsthand, how do you block that out once you've seen that? So he was a very sociable person, and he went on with his life. And but you could feel that was a darkness with him, because you lose your trust in humanity then. How could they? And no one had known that what we were capable of then. As James Hillman says, he says we have to. Well, no, actually, it's Carl Jung. He says we have to have wars so that we can see what beast is in the man, the shadow. Anyway, this Saturn-Pluto conjunction took place 1947, and funnily enough, it conjuncts Saturn's, Hitler's Saturn, 13 degrees Leo, but obviously died before then. If he hadn't died, you wonder then, because 1947, that was the start of the Cold War. What would have happened if he'd still been in power? It doesn't bear thinking about, but maybe there was a sort of fate that he would have been. But anyway, that was the start of the Cold War. Saturn-Pluto conjunction at 13 degrees Leo. That is as though that point was still going on. That degree of the zodiac was still going on in a different form. Okay, so the next. Oh, and diary was first published. So it was published in Holland in 1947 under that Saturn Pluto, and obviously it was a terror. It was about war, and it was about the terror and everything, and it was. But she was published, so yeah. The Versailles Treaty, again, I don't want to go into it all now, but you can see Pluto conjunct Sun. All these points are picked up. Neptune again, where Pluto would be in World War II, on and on. So I won't go into it, but obviously, you can look into it if you're interested. So, okay, so back to the ruby slippers. Yeah, so that was her favorite film, Wizard of Oz, Somewhere Over the Rainbow. Bad guys, good guys, but really, we need to look deeper than that, to the shadow. It is the shadow of mankind. It wasn't just the Nazis. The Nazis expressed what was in humanity, and that there should be something like that in humanity, and there still is. I mean, you can't just say it was the Nazis, because they were expressing it. Hitler expressed it for them, and they expressed it for him, and it's the shadow. So, yeah. So the next. No Place Like Home, which is poignant, over the rainbow, as with Anne's Pluto in Cancer in the 12th house. And incidentally, Hitler's North Node was at 16, 17 degrees Cancer, conjunct her Pluto. Yeah, but home, when you look at the solar eclipse in 1999, that was when she was made one of the most important 100 people of the time by Time magazine, Time 100 Most Important People of the Century. 12 degrees solar eclipse again. And that's the ruby slippers. That's she was immortalized, and yeah, she it's funny, it's looking at the Sabian symbols. I'll just read that quickly because it's so interesting. The Sabian symbol for her, yeah, there we go. Sabian symbol for her Pluto in Cancer was the germ grows into knowledge at 17 degrees Cancer. The germ grows into knowledge and life. Life streams from little fountains flow, tall oaks from little acorns, like James Hillman is talking about the daemon, the acorn grow. Yeah, so, and then the polarity point, 17 Capricorn in the 6th house is a girl bathing in the nude, self-conscious revelation, speaking our truth, which she did. And her truth went on. So, so after that, next. So this is the solar eclipse, 17 degrees Cancer, 1945. Again, conjunct her Pluto, the year after the July 6th lunar eclipse, that they left the house a month after. And at that point, on July 6th, Otto, who was the only survivor, her father went back to the house on the anniversary of when they entered it. And that's when Miep presented him with the diary on this solar eclipse, 17 degrees Cancer. And yeah, the rest is history. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michaela. Fantastic.
It was long.
Yes, it was great.
World War II, I mean.
Yes. Well, we must wind down now because we have another meeting coming up. So thank you for that amazing effort. And so thank you from all of us. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Michaela. Great meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. May there be no more wars.